We think we have it up on her personal computer, but we're trying to get it up on the main computer so we can both watch and listen at the same time.
Okay, no problem. If you need me to send an invite to another Hangout address or anything, just let me know.
Okay. Oh, I think we're good.
You're okay? If one of you guys can just mute your speakers so that there's no echo or anything, then we should be good to go. Hello? Now both your mics are muted.
Yes, I did.
Okay. Yeah, you can both have your mics unmuted. Just one person has to have their speakers turned down so that it's not feeding back.
Right. So would it be the speakers on yours? Are you still getting feedback?
Nope. I can still kind of hear when you guys talk to each other, but I'm not hearing myself anymore, so that's fine.
Okay. Yeah, those voices in your head can.
Okay, are you guys ready to go? All
Yes.
right. Any questions before we get started?
No.
All right, perfect. So, just one thing I want to point out, if you guys haven't already set up an account, we do have a chat channel on Slack.com. If you go to the Spark website, there's instructions on how to set up an account there. But basically, if you, at any point during the teacher training for the next 4 weeks or even on, as we get closer to the actual event, if you have any questions for me at all and you need an answer ASAP, I'm usually in that chat channel that we set up, so feel free to jump in there and ask whatever questions or leave any notes that you need, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Otherwise, Nikki's been emailing me, so if you guys need to email me for anything, that works too, but I'm usually on that chat all day, and I can respond immediately, so just make sure you set that up if you haven't already. Okay, so first things first, if you log in to Scratch, if you've set up your account and everything, this is essentially the first screen that you should see right when you create a new account and launch the Create button or the editor in Scratch. It's pretty basic layout, but I'll go over each of the sections and then we'll actually get into kind of the coding aspect of it. Before we start though, do either of you have experience with coding in any kind of capacity? Have you used Scratch before?
I personally have not used Scratch, but I am a mobile development student, so I have programmed in Java, XML, and HTML.
Okay, perfect. How about you, Mike?
What about you, Mike? He just left.
Is that a good laugh or a bad laugh?
No, I'll be leading most of the instructional pieces
Okay.
of that for Mike.
Okay, perfect. So since you're kind of already familiar with it, I'll still probably just for the sake of clarity, I might cover stuff that you already know how to do or concepts that you're already familiar with. Just let me know and I can skip over them if need be. But basically, the Scratch window is set up into 3 primary sections that we'll use on and off in different ways. The first one is this section on the left-hand side. Can you guys see my screen okay?
Yeah.
Okay, the first one is on the left-hand side here. In the middle, this is called the stage, and in the middle of the stage, you'll see a little character named Scratch the Cat. He's kind of the Scratch mascot, and you'll see him all throughout the program. But basically, this stage is where our kind of final program or our final game, in this case, will live. It's where all the actual interactivity happens, where the program actually runs, and where everything really happens. So this is kind of the focus of the Scratch window. Below that, in the same section, we still consider this part of the stage, but it's a slightly different section, is this part at the bottom. This part is a listing, as you can see, of what are called sprites and backdrops. Sprites are essentially anything that you can interact with in Scratch, whether it be characters in your game or your story, items that the person can pick up or use, things that they can click on. Basically anything that has any kind of interaction is a sprite. Okay? And then backdrops are kind of the backgrounds of the game. It's what the stage looks like, what the level looks like, and we can change those as different things happen, but essentially it's just kind of the cosmetic, what the game looks like. So far so good?
Yep.
Okay, the next section is our tabs here, and the main tab is probably the one we're going to use the most. It's called the scripts tab. The scripts are set up into different categories of blocks, and these blocks are basically the instructions that you give Scratch to do whatever it is you want the program to do or whatever you want your game to do. For the most part, we're going to use these top 4 blocks. They're kind of the very basics of what you can do with Scratch. And then later on at the end of today's session, we'll use one of the blocks from the sensing section, but we're going to focus on these top 4. There's also a tab for costumes, which is just a fancy way of saying what our sprite looks like. And then there's a sounds tab as well, which we're not going to touch at all today, but we'll get into tomorrow and next week and then the following weeks. Okay?
Gotcha.
The third section is called the workspace, and this is basically where most of the quote-unquote coding happens in Scratch. This is where you drag the different blocks to actually make things happen, and it's where Scratch kind of follows its instructions. You put the recipe on the right-hand side, and Scratch will literally do those instructions in order, in the order that you put them in there. A quick note about the workspace, and something that we'll just want to keep track of, is right now we only have one sprite here on the left-hand side, and so in the upper right-hand corner you'll see kind of a little ghosted version of that same sprite. This just tells you what your currently highlighted or selected sprite is, along with its current position. So you'll notice that it says X0, Y0. The Scratch stage is set up in a XY coordinate grid. So positive values of X move to the right, negative values move to the left. Y values, you can kind of see down at the bottom here too as I move the mouse. Y values go up as you move up, and they go negative as you move down. So as you start to position things on the stage, it's kind of important to know that stuff. But it's always listed. Your character's current position will always be listed here on their workspace. So far, so good?
Yep.
Okay. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start just with the very basics. I'm going to grab one of these move blocks under the motion section, and I'm going to drag it into my workspace. And what will happen is it doesn't really do much until either I double-click on it. So if I double-click on that block, you'll notice Scratch the Cat kind of moves over, and if you look at the X position, he moves 10 pixels or 10 steps to the right every time I double-click on it. If I change that to a negative number, he moves to the left. Or the other way that I can move him if I don't want to use these blocks is I can actually click and drag him and move him around the stage.
Will that remember those movements though if he clicks and drags?
Mike wants to know if it'll remember the movements if it clicks and drags.
It doesn't remember them necessarily unless you grab one of these blocks. So what you'll notice as I'm dragging this around, that there are a few blocks, just as an example, this go to X, Y block and this glide to X, Y block. As I move him around, those blocks, the numbers inside them change. So I can have it actually follow my movements by moving him to where I want him, dragging that block in, moving him again, snapping that next block in, moving him again, and then if I double click on these, he'll basically do those movements. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yes.
So the first thing we're going to want to do is just kind of set him up right in the middle and practice some moving. So I'm going to just move him 10 steps to the left, 10 steps to the right. Now, one of the things that you'll kind of figure out as you go along with Scratch, if I take a bunch of these and alternate them to where he's going 10 steps to the left, 10 steps to the right, 10 steps to the left, 10 steps to the right, and I double click on this, now that these are all connected, if I double click on these, this will actually run this series of steps. Okay? So I'm going to double click on it, and nothing happens. Any idea why?
Because it just cancels itself out.
Kind of, yeah. It is actually doing every single one of these steps, but it's doing them so fast, it's doing them immediately, one after the other, that it basically cancels itself out. Okay. So in order to actually get something to happen when we have this series of steps there, we need to move to one of these other categories of blocks. And the one we want is the control blocks. Control blocks are probably some of the most important blocks in Scratch because they actually dictate the logic of our code. So since you're familiar with like Java and JavaScript, this is really similar to like your for loops, your if-thens, your for while loops, things like that. So we've got a block that essentially will wait in between each step. So if I grab these wait blocks and then double click on this, then you'll kind of start seeing him dance.
Aww.
Just back and forth, super simple, nothing crazy. Make sense so far?
Yep.
Okay. So another thing that you might want to happen is obviously when we're forcing him to do these steps by double clicking on them, your program or your game is obviously not going to be very friendly or very usable if people have to click each of these individual blocks. We can have different types of movements. I'm just going to make a little chain here again. Obviously in our game we might want him to do this versus this, but it's kind of silly to make our users or whoever is using the game click on these every single time they want those to happen. So Scratch has some special blocks that allow you to dictate when certain things happen, and those are called events. So if we go into the events section, I can set it up so this first block, for example, says when green flag clicked. And if you look at our stage, you'll notice there's a green flag in the corner and then a red stop sign. This basically is kind of the same as saying when our program launches. The green flag launches this program and starts it. So now if I grab that block and add it to the top here, this isn't going to do anything until I click that green flag. Okay. Notice how when I click the green flag, it highlights the block that's currently moving. Just in case you guys can't see that. Okay, and I also have the ability, instead of just starting something right when the game starts, I have these other blocks too that allow me to set when the space bar is pressed, for example. So now if I run my program again, he'll do his little dance at the beginning. And then if I tap space bar, every time I press space bar, he'll do that same thing.
Oh, nice.
Make sense?
Yep.
Okay. Now again, you'll notice that when I pressed space bar, all of these things happened pretty much instantly. They all happened at the same time, so he kind of turn, move, turn, move, turn, move, turn, move, all at the same time. So if you want to cause a delay, you'll need to add those wait blocks. Another thing that you might notice too is in the motion section, especially when we were rotating Scratch the Cat, these move steps blocks move him in whatever direction he's facing. But we also have blocks down here near the bottom that allow you to actually move him just by XY coordinates. So if I rotate him, the move steps blocks will kind of move him forward in whatever direction he's facing. So you'll notice he kind of goes at an angle. Whereas these blocks just move him along the X and Y coordinates. So it might not be useful for this particular project, but depending on the type of game you want, if you wanted to do like an asteroids type game where there's a spaceship that you can rotate around, it's good to know that these blocks will move it forward, whatever direction that may be, and these just move exactly left, right, up, and down. Make sense?
Yep.
All right, any questions so far?
I think we're good so far.
Okay. So, in order to kind of start a game, the first thing we're going to do is set up our level, and then we'll set up Scratch the Cat and what he's going to do, and then we'll set up the actual game portion. We'll set up something for him to do. So, I'm going to start by clicking on the stage here on the left-hand side, and as I said before, the stage is just kind of the level of the game. And we can make our stage look like pretty much anything, but we have some options. If we look below where the stage is, the first option allows us to choose a backdrop from library. Scratch has a kind of pre-set up library of characters and backdrops and animations and items and things like that that we can choose from. We also have the ability, there's a paintbrush here that allows us to actually paint a backdrop. So I can just kind of scribble in my workspace, and then that immediately updates. We also have the ability to upload our own backdrops if we have files that we've made in advance or anything like that. And then our last option is to use our camera on the computer to take an image that we're going to use either as a sprite or a backdrop or whatever we want. Okay, so I'm just going to grab a backdrop from the library. And I'm going to choose this soccer goal. And so you'll notice that as soon as I choose that, the stage updates with that backdrop. Scratch kind of stays in his spot where he's at, and it switches to the Backdrops tab. Okay, so if I wanted to, I could paint some more on this if I wanted to customize it a little bit. For now, though, we're just going to change back to the Scripts tab. Okay. Now, our backdrop is obviously a soccer goal, so we're going to make a little bit of a soccer game. It's not going to be a very complicated game, it's not going to be very in-depth, but it should give you at least some idea of some of the things that you can do with Scratch. So I'm going to start by putting in our when flag clicked. You want to be sure that you click on Scratch the Cat first so that he's the item that's highlighted. We're not going to do anything with the backdrops in this particular training, but you actually can set up blocks for the backdrop as well if you want the game itself to do some things. As an example, if you wanted to keep a high score or something like that, you wouldn't want the individual character to keep track of that because multiple things might affect it.
Gotcha.
So you want to make sure that your character is actually highlighted when you're putting the blocks together. And just because I might be adding other sprites, I probably want to use a name that's a little bit more specific than Sprite 1. So Scratch, or whatever sprite I have selected, has a little letter I in the upper left-hand corner of it. I'm going to click that and just change the name here so it's a little bit more specific. And that way, if I have multiple characters or multiple cats or anything like that, I know exactly which one I'm working with, and I'm not looking through lists of just Sprite 1, Sprite 2, Sprite 3, Sprite 4, that kind of thing. Okay. So we'll set this up in one of two ways. First, I'm going to drag Scratch kind of over here on the left-hand side, and we'll start off by resetting his position. So right now, our game doesn't do anything, but I can safely assume that at some point, Scratch is going to move around on the level somewhere. And no matter where we move him, I always want him at the start of my game to go back to the same spot. So he starts off on the left-hand side of the screen no matter where we move him. So I'm going to grab one of those go to XY blocks. And since I've dragged him to the left-hand side of the screen, those numbers have already been updated. So I know no matter what happens when I start the program, he's always going to jump back to this same spot. Okay? And now I'm going to say that he's just going to run past this line, and we'll eventually probably want like a soccer ball or something for him to kick into the goal. But I'll just say he'll run to right about there. And I have one of two options. I can either put in another go-to block, which, as you'll note, it does everything immediately again, so he just kind of flashes into that spot. So I'll need to add a wait. So if I press my flag now, he starts at his original spot and then moves to the second spot. But we have a slightly better motion block that we can use for this. I'm going to just disconnect these for a second. We can add them back if we need to. If you want to delete any of these blocks at any point, you can also just drag them back into this section and it will delete them. I don't want to do that just yet. But we have a second type of motion block called the glide block. And the glide block does almost exactly what the go-to block does, except instead of immediately making that change, you are allowed to specify a time frame. So in this case, I'm saying over the course of 1 second, go from wherever you currently are to this new position. So now when I click the green flag, he'll kind of slowly glide into place. Make sense?
Yep.
Okay, so now that we have Scratch actually doing something, we can go ahead and add another sprite and add a soccer ball.